Hello and welcome to the 778th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO. I'm happy you're able to join us, and again, thank you for being here. I'd like to welcome students joining us virtually today from Harvard, Columbia, and Georgetown, as well as members of our 2024 class of ECNY Fellows. As a reminder, we're accepting applications to join this select group of next-gen business thought leaders. If you know someone who might be a good fit for our class of 2025, you can find the application on the club's website. As you know, the Economic Club of New York's been hosting conversations such as these for now over 117 years. We're proud to stand as the nation's leading nonpartisan platform for discussions on economic, social, and political issues. And following last week's election, we could all use some nonpartisan discussion, particularly around topics our club members really care about, such as the future of monetary and fiscal policy. I'm pleased to welcome back guests who are both experts in these areas, leading economists and ECNY club members, Glenn Hubbard and Larry Summers. Glenn is the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia University and served as Dean of Columbia's Graduate School of Business from 2004 to 2019. He served as chair of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors from 2001 to 2003, and chair of the Economic Club of New York, by the way, from 2007 to 2010. Currently, he's chair of the board of MetLife and a director at BlackRock. He received his master's and PhD from Harvard. Larry Summers is a Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus of Harvard University, and the Weil Director of the Mosava Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard's Kennedy School. He has served in a series of senior policy positions in DC, including as 71st Secretary of the Treasury for President Clinton, Director of the National Economic Council for President Obama, Vice President of the Development Economics, and also Chief Economist of the World Bank. Currently, he chairs the board of the Center for Global Development, serves as vice chair of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and holds board director roles at DOMA, OpenAI, and Skillsoft Corporation. Larry has degrees from MIT and Harvard. So today's format will be a conversation with the two of them wrapping up precisely at 1 o'clock. As a reminder, the conversation is on the record, and we do have media on the line. Glenn and Larry, first, thank you both for giving us your special time today, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Barbara, and thanks everyone for joining. Obviously, since we had this last conversation, a little bit's gone on. The U.S. economy is not in recession. In fact, last quarter was growing above what CBO described as a long-run trend. Inflation's coming down with an asterisk that we'll probably get to in our conversation today. And oh, by the way, we had an election, and the election was a bit of a thunderclap that has wide-ranging implications, obviously, for economic policy, both in the United States and around the world. When Larry and I were trying to think about what to talk about today, we wanted to talk about the election and the Fed and fiscal policy, but also a number of international concerns as well. So Larry, let's just dive in. I mean, how do you process from an economic policy perspective what just happened as the election occurred? Does it change the outlook? What do you see for policy? Things like that.
Look, I'd start with this. Inflation is a really toxic thing. Joe Biden's is the third Democratic presidency in the last 75 years to have ended with a substantial shift towards the right in American politics. The first was Lyndon Johnson's presidency. The second was Jimmy Carter's presidency. Both of those were substantially implicated by inflation. And I think it's very clear from all the exit polling and the discussion that fairly or unfairly, rightly or wrongly, the fact that prices were judged to be substantially higher than they had been 4 years ago, and that interest rates, the cost of money, are substantially higher than they were 4 years ago, was probably the single most important factor shaping votes. So it seems to me that any administration going forward has to take the measure of that and recognize that the American evidence, and indeed the evidence all over the world, is that electorates are unforgiving where inflationary errors are concerned. Obviously, in thinking about what happened in the election, there were a set of developments having to do, or non-developments having to do with immigration that were very important, and very much a cultural sense that the party that talks the most about the middle class had, through a variety of values choices it made, lost its connection to the middle class. So that's how I interpret what happened. And now it will be for political actors in Washington to make their policy judgments, and for investors to assess what's likely. It seems to me, looking at it from their point of view, that a central lesson that the Trump administration and president and his advisors should be learning from what happened is the political toxicity of inflation. And that should lead them to want to be very cautious about any policy program, whatever its other merits, that is likely to be experienced by voters as inflationary. And I have to say, there's a lot, it seems to me, and this is not a political judgment, it's an analytical economic judgment. Seems to me there's a great deal in what was talked about during the campaign that raises questions about inflation. But what do you think, Glenn?
I would agree with that broadly, Larry. I think the big lessons really were, first and foremost, inflation, or more aptly put, higher prices. I think the public got frustrated when economists and government officials said, well, inflation's coming down. And people say, well, the prices are still too high. I think that was very, very toxic. And I think the lack of connection to kitchen table issues, inflation is one, but others, just employment opportunities and things like that. So I think that's the really big lesson. In terms of public policy, while I'm always skeptical because I'm an economist, I feel very optimistic for prospects of a Trump presidency on economics. Indeed, I see there's a chance for what I would call an awakening in policy, an awakening meaning take sort of more traditional conservative policies, but make them broader and more inclusive. So I do think the Trump administration has opportunities in growth. I think they have opportunities in tax policy. We'll come to that. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act has to be looked at. The skepticism I might have would be temptations toward very high use of tariffs or other protectionist policies. But I think economic policy is up for grabs. The one caution I'd remind viewers is, even with a almost sure now GOP sweep, the majorities are not such that they're error-proof. So there are lots of compromises that will need to be made in public policy. But I think there's a real opening for President Trump if he and his team choose to take it. I don't know what your thoughts are, Larry.
So I think there are some important opportunities, and I'll get to those, and we'll get to those in the conversation. But I guess the longer I'm around, the more I think that there's a deep truth in the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. And it seems to me that there's very substantial risk that the president will attempt to implement what he talked about. And if he does, I think the consequences are likely to be substantially greater inflation than was set off by the excessive Biden stimulus. Why do I say that? The president has discarded monetary probity as a value, made clear that repeatedly that he believes the Fed should not be independent, made clear repeatedly that he believes a weak dollar is in America's interest because it strengthens the competitiveness of American producers. The fiscal position we'll get to in more detail, but if you take all the campaign promises, it's hard to see a budget deficit as a share of GDP of less than 10% in the out years. So you start on the demand side with almost everything being foot on the accelerator. And then it seems to me there are two substantially adverse developments that are not peripheral comments, but are central campaign pledges. One is the tariffs, and an increase of tariffs of that magnitude raises not just the price of imported goods, but the price of all the goods that compete with imported goods and are disciplined by the possibility of imports. So you have a substantial adverse supply shock from higher prices coming from there. And you also have, look, I think that we as a country do need to do much more to address issues on our borders. And we are not going to be able to support policies that foster strong community in our country if everyone in the world can come take advantage of those policies. So as someone who's progressively oriented, I think that being able to have some rules about who's in the family and who's not is absolutely essential. That said, I don't see how you can contemplate the deportation of millions of workers without running a substantial risk of labor shortage, which in turn is an inflationary force. So I think for the confidence and trust to be restored, it is essential that the disinflationary project that the country has embarked on be successful and maintained, not because disinflation makes people feel great or rich or solves all the problems, but because its absence leads to what I think are very grave consequences. And so I think the most important initial task is to figure out how you're going to be fiscally responsible, figure out how to be respectful of the Federal Reserve and make sound appointments there, adjust the nationalist economic policy towards one that focuses on potential US tariffs as leverage to make deals to reduce barriers in other countries rather than wanting to actually implement the tariffs, and refocusing the emphasis on immigration towards limiting the new flow of immigrants rather than trying to bring about large-scale deportation. I think without that, it is difficult to see how we escape substantial inflation. And with substantial inflation, it's difficult to see how anything else goes well. Would you disagree with any of that?
Well, I would agree with you on the challenges. I actually am much more willing to give the new team the benefit of the doubt on tariffs as leverage, on trying to think through tax policy. There are improvements that could be made in the TCJA, particularly on the business side, bringing back expensing. I think those are good. I'm not a fan of no tax on tips. I suppose no tax on economics professors' salaries I could live with, but I think opening up TCJA too much is likely to be costly. But I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Likewise, on the Federal Reserve, I too am alarmed when I hear discussions about intervention, but I'm in much more of a wait and see mode.
don't
But I want to change
don't,
the, yeah.
don't misunderstand me. I tried to choose my words carefully. I said that if the campaign rhetoric is carried through on, it would be substantially inflationary. I don't have a basis for making judgments about whether it will be or will not be. I'm simply recording what the consequences of it and would be. And there, I think we agree. I think as patriots, we both want the same things, and I'm not going to make pessimistic statements about the choices that are likely to be made. That's just not something where I feel I have any expertise. I think we may have a fairly fundamental disagreement, Glenn, on this. I see the deficit as a looming large problem. I don't know when a day of reckoning will come, and I don't think it's prudent to be crying wolf that crisis is imminent all the time. But I don't see how a path to 10% of GDP or more deficits ends well. Ends well because I worry about how long the world's greatest debtor can be its world's greatest power. I worry about crowding out of private sector activity. I worry about financial accidents. I worry about the lack of ability to respond to contingencies. So seeing those deficits, and I think 10% is a modest estimate of what we are risking if interest rates spike, if we have national security contingencies, if people define the tax agenda very broadly, it could be 15% of GDP in the early 2030s, and not in 1 year, as with President Biden, but on a permanent basis. And I think that would just be catastrophic. So we need large adjustments. I don't see how it would be responsible to carry forward essentially any of the expiring tax provisions without the adoption of measures that offset the increase in the deficit. And I don't see those measures as being in prospect. Do you?
I think we definitely share the concern over large deficits, and neither party has been particularly good at this in recent years, to put it mildly. We are going to need higher defense spending. TCJA is an opportunity for mischief as well as good. I can say this, that on the individual side, which is where the expiring provisions largely are, one option is to keep the base broadeners and let some of the rates go back up. I'd be fine with that. I don't know that that's politically salient. On the business side, I do think we need to bring back expense. That's not terribly expensive, but it is the most pro-growth part of what we're doing. As always, the biggest parts of the budget lie in the entitlements. And I just don't see an appetite at the present time to reform it, even though you or I might sit at a table and say, do that. So I think that's where we are. I don't see the nation getting to 10 or 15% budget deficits, but I do see the problem not going away if we don't do something about it.
Well,
I wanted to ask you another question.
Let me see if I can just understand what might be agreements and disagreements. Are you broadly in agreement with me that Elon Musk would be lucky to find $200 billion, let alone $2 trillion in annual implementable efficiencies of the kind that he talks about, the kind of thing that exists in a corporation where you take some labor out with productivity improvements? That if you just look at what the government does, payroll is whatever it is, 10 or 15% of the total federal budget. And so the scope for curbing waste of the kind that he talks about is probably well under 10% of the claims that he's made. Would you agree with that?
Well, I haven't made a particular assessment, but I can say it's going to be challenging. It's actually nice to have a fresh pair of eyes like his on it. But if you take entitlements off the table, you take interest payments off the table, you take defense spending off the table, it's just mathematically impossible to find $2 trillion of spending a year to do. So on that, I think we could agree.
Okay, so we agree on that. Do we agree that I can't tell whether we agree or not. I could find a tax package that I would like better than letting everything expire. It would probably involve some of your expensing coupled with some significant rate increases. So I could find a package that I'd like better than everything expiring. But I'd rather let everything expire than do anything that was a net loss to the fisc. I think that the deficit problem is sufficiently urgent that the first priority should be no revenue loss to the objective of extension. Is that a place where you'd be able to join me?
I think that's a hard ask because of the cost of TCJA. In the real world in which we live, I think that's just incredibly unlikely. And my worry is if we open everything up, then we get something that's even larger budget deficits than what we have.
Well,
So
no, we
I
can
think
open
this
it
is
up.
one we may disagree.
Well, I'm not in the business these days of judging congressional reality. I'm saying from an economic point of view, I think almost any tax cut or collection of tax cuts relative to the baseline that is deficit enhancing is likely to have adverse economic effects. That I would not give up government revenue in order to have some of the tax cuts that in the abstract I think are desirable tax cuts. I think the government is profoundly over leveraged given the commitments to which the nation is absolutely made to defense, to healthcare, to retirement security for the aged. So I just think that it's very dangerous to open up the idea that there's desirable tax cutting relative to what's in current law, unless it's absolutely clear that part of the desirable tax cutting is to be matched by other tax increasing.
Well, I think on that we could agree. If you're going to have new tax cutting in this, you should absolutely be offsetting that. I'm just saying there's a political challenge with closing all of the current law baseline in TCJA. But we should move on because there's a lot to talk about. There's one other election thing I wanted to ask you about, which is I know that there's a view that the election's about populism and things like that, but as someone who's conservative, I often wonder whether it's also about more traditional conservative ideas of what works. For example, isn't it getting too hard to build anything or do anything in America? Aren't we seeing too much disenchantment, not just from average people, but from financiers and elites on what we're doing to financial markets with certain social objectives? I mean, how do you think about these sorts of factors?
Look, I think there is a grave problem of a constricted or even constipated capacity of the country to do things. It shows itself in the fact that the Second Avenue subway costs 10 times as much per kilometer as Paris or Ankara. It shows itself in the fact that repairing a little bridge that connects Harvard Square with Boston, where the Harvard Business School is, involved traffic being closed on one lane of traffic for 62 months, 50% longer than it took to win World War II. It shows in the fact that there was an effort made, I think probably the right effort, about a decade ago to put suicide nets under the Golden Gate Bridge. That effort to install suicide nets took longer than building the whole Golden Gate Bridge did the first time and cost 85% as much. And one can proliferate these examples. I think ironically, from the point of view of the environmental community, there is no viable future renewable path without very substantial improvements in our systems of electricity transmission. And there is no viable path forward on electricity transmission without substantial amendment of current rules. And one could give the examples of this kind with respect to residential real estate development. One can give examples of this kind with respect to other forms of infrastructure. My colleague, Ed Glazer, tells me that it costs 3 times as much to construct a mile of highway through a rural area as it did in 1965 after correcting for inflation, even though we've got all kinds of new technologies now. So look, President Trump's first significant involvement in public affairs came when he took over the Central Park skating rink and got it repaired and working again when the municipality of New York had failed at that task for years. So my hope would be that we can have a bipartisan project of being able to execute crisply and effectively. And, this isn't just a public sector thing. It's in part a public sector thing. Whenever you think about Elon Musk, the fact that a single entrepreneur can do 5 times as much space lift as NASA has to be a little disconcerting about the way we're running our government. On the other hand, the failings that we've had at Intel or the failings that we've had at Boeing suggests to me that it's a mistake to kind of just say private sector good, public sector bad. So I hope that we will be in a position to engage in a broad national project of thinking about our capacity to execute on great things. And if we're able to do that, I think that we have enormous potential in the years ahead. But I think there is very much a risk of strangulation through the promiscuous distribution of the veto power in American society. And my hope would be that that's something that I think plays to some set of issues that our new president is very much oriented to. And I would hope that he can get cooperation from a wide variety of quarters in doing that.
I would agree with that. I mean, to me, permitting reform, which is not entirely, maybe not even principally a federal issue, is very important. If you're conservative, it may be important for growth and investment. For many progressives and environmentalists, it's also extremely important for the new energy infrastructure that we need. I just don't see a path for either, quote, side in this without permitting reform. I also raised the issue of finance with you. Do you think this is a time to rethink our meddling in financial markets and investments? Should we be letting finance be finance?
I think that that's probably a complicated, I think that's probably a complicated question. Is it a little too easy to manipulate some financial markets? I suspect it's a little too easy to manipulate some financial markets, and that should probably be regulated more effectively than it has been at some points. Have there been excesses that have hobbled the ability of some of our larger financial institutions to do functioning and important and functional things? Yes, I'm sure there have been. Um, we have the rhetoric and in some cases the policies and the requirements gone too far on various kinds of social investing? I think every investor ought to be able to make the investments they want, and there will be some who will choose to set objectives other than maximizing profits. But I have to say that in general, when the central bank or the securities regulatory agency set out to save the climate, I am rather nervous, not because I'm not in favor of saving the climate. I think there's much more that needs to be done there, but I'm worried about the application of those tools to uh, that kind of objective. Look, I think another thing to be said, and some of this has found its way into various financial things. I would like to see a return to Martin Luther King on people judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And I think there's an important admonition there to both the right and the left, because I think there still are very important elements of discrimination in our society that absolutely need to be rooted out and not to be tolerated. But at the same time, I think the veneration of identity as a category is highly problematic. I think the attempt to regard it as a given, and this is a thing in academic life, but not only in academic life, to regard it as a given that your perspective is shaped by your demography is, I think, something that is really quite problematic. And I have to say, Glenn, that while there's a lot obviously that's gone on in the last week that has been troubling to me, something that I found gratifying is that a woman was appointed as a White House chief of staff for the first time. And the fact that it was a woman was taken for granted, and that appointment was discussed in terms of its implications and its merits rather than the gender. And we've learned today that the Secretary of State for the first time is likely to be a Hispanic American. And it's and as I've read the discussions of it, the emphasis has been on what his foreign policy doctrines have been, what his past relationship with the president has been, but not I emphasize, with his history or his demography. And I think that if we can get to a place where we're doing more excellence venerating and less identity focusing, and that goes to various questions about how financial markets operate as well, I think it will be a very good thing.
I couldn't agree more. Both kudos to the Trump team for the way they're starting out here, and also the way not to discriminate is not to discriminate. So I agree with you on that. I want to, before going to the Fed, I want to go back to taxes for a minute, because this is something that is going to happen in 2025. So I want to make sure we're clear. So I would put on the table further business tax reform, which to me would be expensing, and if I had my druthers, a cash flow tax as opposed to an income tax. And one could raise revenue by using border adjustments that you could use either for deficit reduction or for further business tax reductions or to pay for any household extension Congress wants. Any thought on that?
Glenn, I'm probably a little bit more macro oriented than you are. So my first and second priorities are that we get to not be using up too much revenue. And that's where I'd start. Some package that raised rates and implemented expensing, I would be sympathetic to. Although I have to say that while when you and I grew up studying with Marty Feldstein, the question of depreciation schedules loomed enormously large, and there was lots of reason to think they had big effects on capital formation. In today's world, where the canonical investment is a piece of software or a piece of hardware that will obsolete in 4 years, the question of depreciation schedules versus expensing, and where interest rates are much lower than they were when you and I first began studying these questions, I am sympathetic to expensing, but in a world of high leverage, low interest rates, and short-lived capital, I don't think of the expensing issue as being nearly as important an issue as I would have thought a generation ago when you and I were starting out. All things considered, I'd move in that direction, but I don't think it is quite as high a priority for me as the way in which you spoke would suggest.
Okay. Well, let's turn to the Fed. Obviously, as we started out, inflation or high prices was a big factor in the election. Inflation has come down from the alarming levels we saw after COVID. But that said, if you look at 5-year forward estimates, there's clearly a lot of room for the Fed to go in terms of getting to an absolute 2% target. Has the Fed won a battle, won the war, won anything? How would you describe it?
Look, I think the Fed made what ex post were egregious errors of judgment. The idea that the Fed could have been guiding the market to think that the Fed funds rate would stay at zero until the summer of 2024, when the economy was booming in the summer of 2021, and the budget deficit was reaching 14% of GDP, is astonishing, and I think was a huge error. I think they recovered from that error better than I feared would be the case, and with less damaging consequence than I feared would be the case over the subsequent years. So that's kind of where I am on the Fed looking back. Looking forward, I don't really understand quite why they're doing and saying what they're doing and saying. I just spoke with somebody before getting on this call who I think has a relatively conventional view. He thinks that the inflation rate will be 33 basis points for the last month, will be about 3.5% at annual rates for the last quarter, and will be at about 3.1% for the last year. So I look at CPI inflation above target and as core, above target, and if anything, rising. The economy growing more rapidly than potential. The markets on fire and reaching levels that by some valuation metrics are twice or three times a century levels. And I ask myself, why is cutting rates a priority into that environment? And so, the Fed has given signals and it has to maintain some fidelity with those signals. But in general, the strong asymmetric push of markets towards rate cutting from here seems to me to have been misguided, and the markets have hugely adjusted. It used to be that the trough of the Fed funds rate in this cycle was estimated at 2.85. Now it's closer to 3.85. So I think that's a very welcome adjustment, but they never should have been at 2.85. And that's a failure of the Fed's signaling. And my own judgment would be that the Fed and markets are still underestimating the overheating risk. And in particular, I think the Fed is substantially miscalibrated on the question of what the neutral rate is. If the neutral rate was 2.5 before COVID, I don't see how, in a world of greater than 100% debt to GDP ratios, huge and rising budget deficits, massive new demand for renewable energy and for energy for data centers, large wealth effects coming from major run-ups in asset markets, and a very different inflationary psychology. I think it's just untenable to imagine that the neutral rate has only increased by 50 basis points. And I think 200 basis points would be a better guess. And if it's 200 basis points, then the neutral rate is 4.5, and policy is only very barely restrictive right now. And so the rationale for the kinds of rate cutting that's been in the dot plot isn't really there. So I am fearful that the Fed is going to be more like once burned, twice burned than once burned, twice shy on inflationary risks. And that's before you get to what I think you have to acknowledge. You're optimistic, I'm agnostic, others are pessimistic about what the impulse coming from the executive branch is going to be. But with normal executive branch policy, it seems to me you would be worried about overheating bubbles and what was the need for rate cutting. And if you think there's at least some risk of substantially inflationary impulse, that case becomes even weaker.
I think you're raising exactly the right concerns, Larry. I thought at the time, and I know you did too, that the Fed's errors are right after COVID were textbook errors, and not just ex post. They were foreseeable that they would be come a cropper. Yes. More recently, I think that not just the Fed, but as you point out, markets too have missed a few things. The notion of, well, why isn't a quote restrictive policy having more of a real effect? Well, first, it wasn't that restrictive, the neutral rate point. Second, we've had a lot of demand from still fiscal stimulus in people's pockets. We've had the AI boom. We've had less of the economy being interest sensitive than may have been in people's heads in markets and in some FOMC members' heads. So for all of those reasons, I think the Fed is a ways away. And I don't know that the neutral rate is high as 450 basis points, but it's clearly a lot higher than the Fed and markets seem to think. And that's not just a concern for the Fed. It's also a concern for the conversation we started with about the fisc because of the interest costs in the government debt. I just don't see at least a rational monetary policy having very low rates compared to where we are now, barring something very big in the economy. One other Fed question I wanted to ask you, though, that the Fed is saying it's going to re-examine its framework, the more recent framework for monetary policy. How should the Fed do that, and what should it do?
I'm not sure. I think one of the challenges in these things is that all steps towards transparency are ratchets. And it is very hard to untake them once you've taken them. In general, I believe that Alan Greenspan and Paul Volcker, in their very different ways, had it right. As you've heard me say before, Glenn, they understood what the Delphi oracles understood, which is that if people look to you for reassurance and they believe you're omniscient and somewhat omnipotent, and in fact, you're very human, the best thing to do is to keep your pronouncements vague and oracular so as to not destroy the illusion. And it seems to me that with the constant cacophony of forward guidance, dot plots, post-meeting press conferences, and 19 FOMC members in front of the press multiple times each month, we have caused the Fed to demystify itself, demonstrate its ignorance and in some cases impotence, and become less able to implement core tasks. So I would favor a return to humility, ranges rather than specific targets, absence of attempts to lay out detailed forecasts, and narrowing of focus away from reflections on social justice, efforts to contain the environment, efforts to improve business ethics. And I think a much more narrowly conceived and technically oriented central bank would be a better outcome from the new framework. Now, whether that is possible, and there are things that don't happen very often in Washington, and one of them is agencies advocating a reduction of the size of their own remit. And so I don't necessarily expect what I just said to happen, but I think when the history of this episode has been fully written, the Fed's last new framework, flexible average inflation targeting, and the set of enhancements to Fed communications that took place, will bear a share of the responsibility for the errors that were made.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Larry. I'd like to see the Fed lose the dot plot, among other things. I do hope that this analysis of a framework is deep. I think Congress may well want to play a role there too. I think there are more voices than you might think in the Fed that would like a smaller remit. I think many Fed officials realize they've been drawn into politics in a way that pure central banking isn't, by some of the things they've been doing. So I'm certainly hopeful there. Personnel is policy. Our new president will be making Fed appointments, and I guess we'll have to see. One other domestic policy area I wanted to ask you about before we look abroad is regulation and antitrust. Those are two areas in which I suspect, although I don't know, we're likely to see some significant differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. Any thoughts on where that should go?
I spoke to a variety of regulatory policy issues earlier in terms of making it easier to move quickly and get things done. Um, I would point up that I think one of the more interesting aspects and successful aspects of the Clinton presidency that is maybe commented on a little bit less frequently is that Ira Magaziner, who had presided over what I think has to be recognized as the disastrous early efforts to implement a rather dirigiste healthcare system, as his next assignment was in charge of internet policy and proposed very much a permissive framework of allowing a great deal of experimentation with respect to the internet. And I think for the most part, that policy has been hugely successful and is a very important reason why the US economy has outperformed the economies of Europe and Japan so substantially over the last generation. And I think there are important lessons in that for anybody thinking about the evolution of new technologies. With respect to antitrust, it is interesting that J.D. Vance has celebrated Lena Khan. So the strands here don't always run along traditional political divisions. My view is that it is very important to have vigorous antitrust law in support of consumer welfare and in support of better deals through competition for consumers, and that the country over the last 30 years has made more mistakes of insufficiently aggressive antitrust policy than it has made of excessively ambitious antitrust policy. That said, almost all the new doctrine that has been proposed, condemning the consumer welfare standard, flying under the flag of something called being neo-Brandeisian, almost everything in that is conceptually new has seemed to me inconsistent with an effectively functioning market system and not very desirable. So I hope there will be some swinging back of the pendulum. And I would say that an aspect that I think is particularly important and has received too little attention is in a very complicated world with very substantial security questions. I am much more worried about our national champions not being global champions than I am our national champions being excessive in their reach and their power and their influence. And I wish that perspective could more fully inform antitrust law.
It's certainly a case that, the antitrust zealots at the moment do have some explaining to do. How would you, quote, break up big tech? I guess we'll have to see. I'm not as much of a Lena Khan fan as our new vice president may be. I want to turn to economic security abroad. So how do you see geopolitical insecurity as affecting economic issues? I mean, one route is just budget. I mean, defense spending having to go up. Another route is risk premia. Another route is, which kind of alliances you construct. I mean, how do you connect those dots to the economic policy decisions the new president will have to make?
More defense, more important to have allies and to do things that build relationships with allies, more emphasis on resilience. I don't know why. I cannot conceive of a rational reason why the United States should have a Bitcoin reserve. But there are a lot of other commodities where, on the same kind of reason why we have a strategic petroleum reserve, I can certainly see a case for contemplating reserves. I think the most difficult questions go to issues of export control and issues of sanctions and issues of restrictions with respect to technology. And I don't feel like I know what the right answers are. I would want everybody making policy in those areas to think about not the current level of US leverage, but the present value of US leverage. And I worry that when we impose sanctions, we may have some leverage in the short run, but in the long run, we educate others that they need to figure out how to be much less dependent on us. And then when they go and become much less dependent on us, we have much less leverage in the future. And so I'd like us to think about our tools of economic pressure and diplomacy through a perspective of the present value of our influence, rather than from a perspective of the current level of our influence.
Agreed. And my guess is building alliances, say with the European Union or Canada or Japan or Australia, is probably not about an across the board tariff. But to your point about sanctions and export controls, how are we to deal with the challenge of China without them?
I don't think we can deal with the challenge of China without them. I think the question is how you draw the line, which I think, by the way, is more difficult with today's technologies than it was with Cold War era technologies, between two different things. These are sensitive national security technologies that are important for our having the strongest and most effective military. And yes, we're going to limit the dissemination of those. And these are technologies that may have some military application, but are pervasively important to building a modern economy. And if our position becomes, or seems to become, that we're trying to suppress access to those technologies, that becomes something that looks more like a economic suppression policy. And economic suppression policies tend to generate truculent responses. It tends to be more difficult to get others to join in the enforcement of economic suppression policies. So I think that's a very, very difficult balance to calibrate. I have a kind of very simple-minded idea in this space, which is when people advocate various interfere with the market policies on national security grounds, I take the issue very seriously and try to evaluate it. When they explain that a great thing about their policy is that it's going to create jobs, I become that much more skeptical about whether they're thinking about it in a serious kind of way. You know, I think a useful area for inquiry and an analogy that I think people may find worth considering is with the Nixon shock. The Nixon shock in 1971, across the board tariffs, devaluation of the currency, John Connally saying that it's our currency but your problem with respect to the dollar, had a lot in common with some of the attitudes behind Trump economic policy. And there was a lot that was perverse about it, but it also did set in motion probably some desirable adjustments in the system. And so I think that is a
Okay.
example that's worth considering.
Well, I think it's our conversation, but Barbara's problem, because I see she's popped back up. So I'm going to turn the mic back to her.
Well, thank you both. And this was just an outstanding conversation. I have to say, folks that are on the conversation are already texting me saying, can we get a summary of this conversation? This is amazing. So thank you again for your time today. I just quickly want to highlight some of the speakers we have coming to the club between now and year end. On November 18th, we have a luncheon featuring General Brian Fenton, the Commander of Special Operations. He will be joined by Chuck Phillips, a member of our board. On the 21st, we'll be hosting Ken Griffin, the CEO of Citadel, and a fellow member, Sonali Basak, will be doing that interview for us. Jack Devine, who's a veteran of the CIA, is going to join us for a webinar on November 25th. And then on December 4th, we have the CEO of animal health giant Zoetis, Kristen Peck, joining us. And of course, Alan Murray, who is another member of the club, like Kristen, will be doing that interview. So I want to also just encourage people to be sure to keep checking the website and your email in the coming weeks, because as always, we do have events that come up that we add. We are working on one in particular that we'd love to get scheduled now that the election's over, that would be pertinent, but fingers crossed that works. And as always, please remember, guests are welcome at the club. You can find more outstanding conversations on demand. We have season 2 of the club's podcast is now live, and you can check that out, the forum, and it's hosted by club member Becky Quick. And finally, as always, we want to recognize members of the Centennial Society joining us today. The contributions of these nearly 400 members continue to provide the financial backbone of support for the Economic Club and all that we do. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you at the next meeting. And Glenn, Larry, great conversation, really timely and very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.